Yes, we have a couple minutes here for questions. That was rich stuff. Thank you. John Mayer.
Yeah, I'll just start off. Thank you very much, Justin, for all your good work over the years. And I agree with the human intel gathering piece. It really confirms a lot of the macro trends, and without it, it really doesn't make sense often. You need the micro and the macro together, and often people do one or the other, but they really go hand in hand. And so I just applaud you for that, because I've seen a lot of bad research with one or the other, and it just doesn't really flesh it out. I just have a quick question, especially on the movements. We're tracking a lot of the church planting movements and stuff, but how do we do you track the ones that are failing? Like, because everyone wants to give you all the good data, but I find it very hard for anyone to report the failure rates, which are often very high, between 50 to, I've heard 75, 80% failure rates in some countries. And, without knowing the failure rate, it's going to skew the data. So I just wondered if you would talk about that, because I've really had a hard time gathering that from sources. They either won't share it because, it affects their funding and those kind of things. So anyways, you get the point here.
Right. I think the challenge here is that it depends upon how we define failure. So let me just kind of address it in a few ways. I specifically work with 40 different movement families. Those movement families, most of them have been around for years. What I normally track, what I do with them is help them to identify where gaps are. So basically that means I work to track which languages in which provinces are engaged, so that we know which languages in which provinces are not, and then movements use that as a gap list, and they will send teams to those places. A lot of the movements have their own internal research, which they do the same thing with. So mine is really kind of a support and a role, and also they kind of use me as the sacrificial lamb that goes into the various conferences and gives the DMM dashboard presentation, so that they don't really have to. And they don't necessarily collect all the lightning that I sometimes do. I would say, so the movement families, the 40 movement families that I track, all of them have been around for a very long time, and none of them at the family level have failed. So that's one thing. I do know of 15 larger movements that have fizzled, what I call a fizzle, but all of them have led to new movements starting. So once you start talking about a movement family or something like that, and those 15 that fizzled, they were decades ago. So the more recent ones that we work with, the movement family doesn't fizzle. So now let's talk about at a national level. Once it's established at a national level, the national level normally doesn't fizzle either. There are a lot of streams and a lot of initiation efforts which do. So I would estimate, and it's really hard to collect this information. People don't collect this kind of thing at a census level, but I would estimate, based on the interviews I've done, that 80 to 90% of discovery groups, of the initial seeker groups, they never become a church. This is true across every movement. And really, if you start to look at a lot of denominations who do cell groups in churches, you will find the same thing. Seeker groups fail at a significant rate because people count the cost and they don't want to pay it. That's okay. I don't view that as a failure of a movement. I view that as, this is the rich young rulers. There's just people out there. So seeker groups fail. Churches, one of the challenges with measuring churches that form out of movements is that our definition of a church and their definition of a church there's a disconnect. We think of a church often by default as a building, as a location, as something that stays for a very, very long time. They think of a church as a collection of people who meet for a time in a specific location, like a house. And if those people move, then that group, it dissolves, right? Or it relocates, or we're not meeting here, we're meeting over there, or we're not meeting on Sundays, now we're meeting on Wednesdays. And so churches, individual church groups, they can bubble and pop and move all over the place. That's not a failure either. That's not a church failing. It is the community is just, moving and reforming. Streams also can fizzle because of persecution issues, because of relocation issues, because of lots of different things. So what I would say is this. I don't know of any recent movement that has failed. I know of very few streams that got to 4 generations in a particular country, and that stream has failed. But there is a lot of churn. There is a lot of form and reform. There is a lot of movement. There is a lot of things, and a lot of that churn, many people in the West would label that as that group failed because they're no longer there. But I don't view that as fail. So a lot of it has to do with how we define failure. And a lot of it has to do with the inability to measure. When you're starting thousands of seeker groups, it's nearly impossible to measure those kinds of things. There's also a security issue, obviously. Some people have tried to track churches with GPS points, and I am not in favor of that at all. That probably didn't fully answer the question, and I'd be happy to talk about it further offline, but that's kind of the issues, the nuances with the issue of what fails. The movements do track health of their streams, and they're very familiar with the health of the individual streams, the spiritual health.
I would like to thank Justin very much for his talk, which I thought was practical and sensible and based on a lot of experience, and would like to suggest that he puts that or transcribes what he said and puts it into print to make it available for people, for pastors and for researchers who might seek to do some more interviews and to do it in a constructive, sensible and useful and practical way. So thank you for what you've done.
Thank you, Peter. I appreciate that.